Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's going to be my final thoughts for week 13 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. Just kind of trimming the fat off the first look video that we did early on in the week. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. We're getting close to 7,000 subscribers, which is absolutely awesome. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well, so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And YouTube tells me around 50% of the people who watch these videos have not yet subscribed. So if you're a frequent visitor to the channel, or if you're new and you like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. That's obviously going to help me out as well. And if you want access to the sheet, link is down below. And without further ado, let's get right into today's video. And as always, I'll start with the quarterback position. And to be honest, not much has changed for me throughout the week. It's the same set of quarterbacks, but I did add two cheaper ones in Jared Goff and Mitch Trubisky, mainly just because of the price matchup, and I like all their pass catching options. And if I like their pass catching options, I have to like the guy getting them the football. So Jared Goff, Mitch Trubisky, they are on the sheet now, as ugly as that sounds. We'll get into that in a little bit. But as of right now, my favorite spend up quarterback, it's the same. It's still Aaron Rodgers at $6,800. You get a nice discount with Rodgers over guys like Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, and Kyler Murray. And I feel like those expensive quarterbacks aren't absolutely necessary this week, and I also don't think Aaron Rodgers is necessary as well. I think he's a fine tournament play, but even then, they are 8.5-point favorites at home, so I'm not really sure if this game is going to be an absolute shootout. But this matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles secondary, I'm not too concerned about. I know they have Darius Slay, but he was getting eaten alive by DK Metcalf, and I think it might be a similar scenario with Devontae Adams, one of the best wide receivers in football. So not overly concerned about the Eagles defense. And if you look at their numbers this season versus the pass, it actually doesn't look too bad when it comes to fantasy points given up. Now, they're 20th DVA versus the pass, which is not very good, but they're now in the 10th fewest points against quarterbacks and only 230 passing yards per game. But you got to keep in mind they play in the NFC East, which has a lot of poor competition, a lot of poor quarterback play. And overall, if you're looking at their schedule, they have not played that many great quarterbacks, so I feel like those numbers are a bit skewed. So I definitely have no issues with Aaron Rodgers. He's been one of the best quarterbacks in football and one of the most consistent quarterbacks in football this season as well. Close to 300 passing yards per game and 3 passing touchdowns. Not really throwing any picks. He's got one of the best wide receivers in football and Devontae Adams to get the ball to. So no real concerns here. I do think he's a fine tournament play, and if you want to stack the passing game for the Packers, I really like the Rodgers, Devontae Adams, and Robert Tonyan stack, or trio if that's what you want to call it, because Tonyan is really cheap, below $4,000, and he certainly has a lot of touchdown upside, so I think that's a nice way to go in tournaments this week. You can play them in cash games. I have no issues with that. I just feel like I might go a little bit cheaper in cash games this week because I feel like this could be a good week to spend down, or at least go more mid-range when it comes to the quarterback position, because it's kind of loaded the mid-range is this week in my opinion. Then going down to Kirk Cousins, who I guess does represent the mid-range. He's in a really good spot versus Jacksonville, and they have a 31-point implied team total, which I believe is the highest on this slate. They're also 10-point favorites at home, so I do have concerns about this game staying competitive. That's why I really like Dalvin Cook, because I could just see the Vikings just running the ball for the majority of this second half. Now, if you have concerns about Dalvin Cook maybe being a little bit banged up, maybe Alexander Mattison, we see a little bit more than him than we'd like to, but I can't really fully assume that as of right now. But I do think this is going to be more of a running game than I think Kirk Cousins is going to throw 4 touchdowns for 300-plus yards because, again, being a 10-point favorite at home usually sets up well for the running back. But a lot of points should be scored in this game from the Minnesota Vikings. And the Jaguars, they're facing a pretty poor Minnesota team as well. So if the defense, when I say poor Minnesota team, I meant the defense. The offense is pretty darn good. You got Kirk Cousins, Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson, Dalvin Cook. The tight ends aren't bad. The backup running back, and Alexander Mattison, is not that bad either. So very good offense, but the defense not that good. So if Jacksonville can somehow keep this game close, Kirk Cousins could have a pretty big game, as could all of the Minnesota Vikings offensive pieces. So definitely interested in the Vikings here, whether it's through the air or on the ground, but both are in great spots here. But this is definitely a team that likes to run the football. They're throwing the ball less than 30 times per game. But when Cousins is throwing, he's getting the ball down the field nearly 9 yards per attempt. And overall, his numbers aren't absolutely terrible this season. In Jacksonville, it's an amazing matchup, the 31st DVA versus the pass. And they're allowing the 3rd most points per game to the quarterback position. So Kirk Cousins, I think he's a very strong play here. Maybe a better suited for tournaments just because I feel like this could be more of a Dalvin Cook game. But either way, I do think he's in a great spot here. Then dropping down to another mid-range quarterback, we have Ryan Tannehill at $6,200 in a great matchup versus Cleveland. So I think the whole world's going to want to play Derrick Henry here. Now, not everyone's going to be on Derrick Henry because I feel like the ownership's going to be split between Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry, with a slight lean on Dalvin Cook just because he's more of a pass-catching back. But this is a great matchup through the air versus Cleveland. Denzel Ward's not going to be playing in this one, which makes it already bad defense versus the pass even worse because he's been one of the top cornerbacks in football this season. I think pretty sure he's leading the league in pass breakups, but good spot here for Ryan Tannehill. The Browns are 23rd versus wide receivers, and you got to keep in mind you got to take Denzel Ward out of the equation. They're going to get Myles Garrett back, which I mean, I know he's a defensive end, but that's obviously going to create more pressure versus Ryan Tannehill, so that could hurt him in that way. But overall, I don't really have too many concerns here for Tannehill here. He should have a decent game. Although, like Kirk Cousins, he's kind of in a really similar situation to Kirk Cousins, where they should put up a lot of points. It's another high total game. They have a team total close to 30, and they're favorites at home. And they both have really good running backs in Derrick Henry and Dalvin Cook. And both these teams like throwing the football. They're both throwing the ball around 30 times per game. So it's kind of like an exact same situation Ryan Tannehill is in with Kirk Cousins, although they're not double-digit favorites. They're only 5.5-point favorites, so it should be at least a little bit more competitive because the Browns offense can certainly put up some points. So he's got to be really efficient, but he's definitely been a guy that's shown he can be very efficient moving the ball through the air. He's got good options to get the ball to in A.J. Brown and Corey Davis. He also has a little bit of rushing upside as well. It's not a lot, but around 13 rushing yards per game, which is not that bad. You always get a little bit of rushing upside there with Ryan Tannehill. And the Browns defense is 23rd DVA versus the pass, and a little bit worse versus the pass than they are versus the run this season. So if they can somehow contain Derrick Henry, I'm not saying they're going to, but if they can somehow contain him, I think Tannehill can have a pretty big day through the air. So I definitely have interest in him. Probably more so in tournaments, but I would not hate getting there in cash games either. It's just, I don't know, the threat of Derrick Henry going for 200 plus yards and Tannehill not really have to do much through the air is always a threat. Ryan Fitzpatrick, though, if he's good to go, I mean, I shouldn't say if he's good to go. It kind of just depends on Tua if he's good to go. If Tua is not good to go, Ryan Fitzpatrick's one of my favorite quarterbacks to use on the entire slate. He's only $6,000, and I just love using Fitzpatrick for fantasy purposes because he doesn't have anything to lose. He goes out there, he has fun, he chucks the ball around most of the time through Devontae Parker. He tends to put up some pretty solid fantasy games. Now, there's some times where Fitzpatrick is absolutely awful and he throws like 4 to 5 picks. There's certainly downside there, but Fitzpatrick's not been bad this season when he started, and I certainly have interest here. Now, the only concern would be that they're 11.5-point favorites at home. There's only a 42-point over-under here, so I'm not really expecting the Bengals to put up too much of a threat here, but if Fitzpatrick can get us 250 yards, maybe close to 300 and 2 to 3 touchdowns, that's good enough for me at $6,000, and he gives us some rushing upside as well, kind of similar to Ryan Tannehill, where it's not a lot, but he's averaging close to 20 rushing yards per game, which if you factor that in, that's around half of a passing touchdown per game built in, because it's about 2 points, and a passing touchdowns is 4 points. So I don't mind it. And the Bengals are also 20-60 versus the pass, and they're kind of more so mid-pack versus quarterbacks. But this is not a defense that I'm scared of. And Ryan Fitzpatrick, if you want to pair him up with Devontae Parker, that'd be one of the better stacks of the week. So definitely like Fitzpatrick there. Then Jared Goff, a new guy that I added later on this week. He's only at $5,800. I kind of overlooked him, but I do think this game has some shootout potential. I know it's only a 48.5-point over-under. Both these defenses aren't absolutely terrible. And when I say that, I'm kind of just hinting towards the Cardinals. The Rams defense is pretty darn good. A lot of good pieces there. But the Cardinals defense, it's not absolutely awful, but it's not that great either. So I don't think Jared Goff's going to have too tough of a time here moving the ball with Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. And he's only $5,800, and I feel like he's a bit too cheap. And ownership could be pretty low just due to him having an absolutely awful game last week. But this season, he's averaging around 275 passing yards per game, throwing the ball more than any quarterback that I have listed here. So I think this should be opportunity. The Cardinals are 12th DVA versus the pass, but they're kind of right mid-pack versus quarterback. So it's not the greatest matchup in the world, but it's not the worst either. I just like his pass-catching options. Like Robert Woods, I believe is $5,800, which is way too cheap, or he's $5,900, I can't remember exactly. Then Cooper Kupp's right at $6,000 or $6,100. That's just a little bit too cheap for me. And if you do want to do a stack like that, you could always run it back with someone like DeAndre Hopkins just to spend up a little bit, or maybe you could even use Christian Kirk if you want or something like that. But I think this game definitely has potential to be a sneaky shootout, despite the total being below 50 points. Derek Carr, another guy who had an absolutely awful game last week, kept turning the ball over, and it was a great matchup versus Atlanta. But he gets another good matchup versus the Jets, maybe even a bit of a better matchup versus the Jets, as they are dead last, 32nd DVA versus the pass. And if we're looking at their overall fantasy points per game given up, they're 29th versus quarterbacks, meaning they're giving up the 4th most points per game, about 24 points per game, and close to 300 passing yards as well. And is really cheap, and Josh Jacobs is a bit banged up, and if he happens to be limited to that game or just completely miss it, they could rely on Derek Carr through the air a little bit more. So great spot versus the Jets. I know he let you down big time last week, but sometimes in fantasy you gotta be willing to forget and have a short memory, and I do have a short memory here for Derek Carr. Not saying he's the best quarterback in the world, but he should be able to get us close to 250, 300 yards and hopefully 2 to 3 touchdowns. I don't think he's an absolute must-play, but it's definitely a really good spot versus the New York Jets. And if you want to get downright ugly, we have Mitch Trubisky at $5,400. I know he's not the greatest quarterback in the world by any means, but he's super cheap, And he's facing Detroit, who is just not that good of a defense. They suck versus the run and versus the pass. They're 26 versus quarterbacks, and they're 28 DV versus the pass, allowing close to 270 passing yards per game. And I like all of his pass catching options too. Allen Robinson's a bit too cheap. Darnell Mooney's cheap. And also, if you want to get really, really cheap, I believe Anthony Miller's at $3,000 or $3,100. So I like all the Bears for the most part. I also like David Montgomery, even though that's through the ground. But at $5,400, you don't need much. They have a team total of 23.75. If he can get you 2 touchdowns and 250 yards, I think you'll be pretty happy at $5,400. He's going to allow you to fit in guys like Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry this week. So he's mainly just a price play and a good matchup. You can't expect much, but if you need the value, he is certainly viable at $5,400. All right, moving on to the running back position. We have a small group of guys here, but it's a small group I feel pretty confident in. But up top, we have the 2 studs in Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry, both above $9,000. So unfortunately, you're probably not going to be able to play both in your lineup. If you can, go for it. Happy for you. But for the most part, you're probably only going to be able to pick one. And if you're using Devontae Adams, you might not even be able to get either of them. But in cash games, I like to side with the running backs over wide receivers. So it's pretty tough to pick, to be honest. If I had to pick one, I'm going to go with Dalvin Cook just because he's slightly more involved in the passing game. They have a slightly higher implied team total, and the matchup versus Jacksonville is absolutely incredible. I know the Cleveland Browns defense is not that great. They allowed James Robinson to get close to 30 points last week, but they're still a little bit tougher versus the run than Jacksonville is, and Dalvin Cook should be able to absolutely eat them up. Now, the only concern I have with Cook is that he did get a bit banged up at week 12. He left the game for a brief period of time, went into the tent, ended up coming back. But it was an overall down game for Dalvin Cook, but he should bounce back in a big way here versus Jacksonville, assuming he is fully good to go. If we get any news that he might be somehow limited in that game, obviously Derrick Henry is the move over Dalvin Cook, but I'm kind of assuming Dalvin Cook is going to be good to go in this one. But both these guys are pretty much the same exact play, both averaging around 115 rushing yards per game, both getting over 20 touches per game, both are scoring a lot of touchdowns, around 5 yards per carry. It's just Dalvin Cook has a slight edge in the passing game, about 25 receiving yards per game and over 3 targets compared to Derrick Henry getting less than 2 targets per game and less than 10 receiving yards. Also has an 8% target share compared to a 12.5% target share. Also, the matchup is a little bit tougher versus Cleveland. Dalvin Cook, the Jaguars, allowing the 5th most points per game to the position, while Cleveland's allowing the 12th fewest. DVOA-wise, it's not much of a difference. Jacksonville is 26th DVOA compared to the Browns being 20th. But, I mean, Dalvin Cook's in such a great spot versus Jacksonville as a 10-point favorite at home. That always sets up well for the running back. Derrick Henry's in a great spot as well. Just for me, slightly going to lean towards Dalvin Cook, but I would definitely want exposure to both. Both are in great spots, but you're probably going to only be able to pick one, so it's kind of a personal preference there. Derrick Henry's is slightly cheaper, which if you need the $300 in savings, I don't think it's going to be too much of a difference in how many points they score where you're going to be too upset about having to go with Henry over Dalvin Cook, but I like both. Then getting into the mid-range here, we have 2 good backs in James Robinson and Austin Eckler. Robinson's having one of the best seasons at the running back position this year. He's getting tons of volume, and he's pretty much the only guy in that backfield. You don't have to worry about him competing with touches. There's never going to be a guy that comes in, steals a touchdown, or really anything like that. He is the guy. He's going to get around 20 to 30 touches. Now, the only concern I have with Robinson is that they priced him up $1,000 from last week, which last week he was way too cheap. I think this is where he usually should be, but you're not really calling him a good value like he was last week. And they're 10-point dogs on the road, so it doesn't usually set up well for the run game. Although he is involved in through the air as well. I believe he had over 5 targets last week. He's averaging around 4 targets per game this season, a 12% target share, and close to 20 rushing attempts per game as well. I believe over the last month he's been around 20, 21, 22 rushing attempts per game. So the volume's there. It's kind of a mid-range matchup versus the Vikings on the ground. They're 16th DVA versus the run and 17th versus running backs with over 100 rushing yards per game. Just not really giving up many rushing touchdowns, so that could be why they're kind of mid-pack versus the run. Overall, they're not that great of a rush defense. So if you had the money for Robinson as your RB2, I think he's a great option. If you want to make him your RB1, I wouldn't hate that either. If you're going to just abandon the 2 studs at $9,500, $9,200, if you think that's way too expensive, maybe you go with Devontae Adams at wide receiver if you want to spend up that much. But Robinson, he's in an excellent spot here. It's just I do worry about them being 10-point dogs on the road, just in case they have to abandon the run and maybe he doesn't see those 20-plus touches that he usually sees most weeks. Then Austin Eckler at $7,100. He returned last week, and he was not limited in any fashion. And the thing I loved about Austin Eckler was of how involved he was in the passing game. He's kind of like Alvin Kamara. I'm not sure if he's as good as Alvin Kamara, but he is definitely a big threat in the passing game. He had 16 targets in that game. 16 targets. There's a lot of wide receivers that wish they could get 16 targets in a game. So if you're going to be a running back that can get me around 15 carries on the ground, and I'm not saying he's going to get 15 to 16 targets every single week, but it should be at least close to double-digit targets every week. And if that's going to be the case, you're going to be highly valuable for fantasy purposes, and it's a good matchup versus New England. In terms of fantasy points per game per given up to the position, they're kind of more so mid-pack, but they're 28th DVOA versus the run, and this is not a rush defense that I'm too scared about here, so definitely have a lot of interest in Austin Eckler. We could talk about the per game numbers, but he hasn't really played many games this season, but when he's been on the field, he has an 18% target share, but the targets that he saw last week were absolutely incredible, and Justin Herbert has no problems getting him the ball, so definitely like him in cash games or tournaments. Either one is fine. Then the cheap running back of the week is David Montgomery at $5,500, as ugly as that sounds, but as ugly as it sounds, I actually like a lot of the Bears this week. You're going to see quite a few Bears on the next slide, or the next sheet here at the wide receiver position, but it's a great spot versus Detroit, and for the most part, these guys are just a little bit too cheap. They're 3-point favorites at home. They have a team total close to 24. Montgomery's coming off his best game of the season, where he had over 100 yards, got into the end zone, had an overall really good day versus a pretty bad Packers run defense. And I feel like Montgomery, I don't think he's going to get around 30 points again, but I think he can get as close to 100 yards total. Hopefully he finds the end zone. If he does that, $5,500, he's definitely going to pay off, and I think he might be the highest owned running back of the week, because I feel like Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry are going to be just a little bit split up, and then in the mid-range, James Robinson and Austin Eckler should be a bit split up, but everyone usually wants to try to find a cheap running back, and Dave Montgomery at $5,500, I think he's going to carry quite a bit of ownership, and ownership projections right now have him being one of the highest owned players on the slate. So if you want to fade that in tournaments, I get it, but in cash games, it's a nice floor to have at $5,500 for someone that should get around 20 touches and a great matchup. Detroit's allowing the most points per game to the position, 23rd DVOA versus the run, over a rushing touchdown per game, close to 50 receiving yards, and over 115 rushing yards per game as well. So a great spot for Montgomery. I think he's an excellent RB2 or a guy you can plug in the flex spot this week. Alright, moving on to the wide receiver position. As you can see, there's a lot of good plays here, whether they're expensive, mid-range, or cheap. But it's always nice when we have a nice variety heading into the weekend. But up top, it's the obvious. It's Davante Adams at $9,000. He's pretty much last year's Michael Thomas, where he's super expensive and it's going to make you forego an expensive running back. But the safety that he offers you is, I mean, there's not many guys that are as consistent as Davante Adams. He gets plenty of volume every single week, averaging over 10 targets per game, averaging over 100 rushing yards per game, and he pretty much scores every single week, averaging over a receiving touchdown per game, a 33% target share, 76% weighted opportunity share, which is, look, I like a lot of these guys, like Allen Robinson, Devontae Parker, Cooper Kupp, but their weighted opportunity share is not even close to Davante Adams. And his numbers this season are just crazy. 0.31 targets per route ran, 0.75 fantasy points per route ran, and close to 3 yards per route ran. He's been absolutely phenomenal. Now, you're going to see the matchup here versus Darius Slay, which, you know, perception that's a pretty tough matchup. But they left him one-on-one versus DK Metcalf on, was that Monday night? And he was getting eaten up. Metcalf had nearly 200 receiving yards in that game. And if they do that again with Davante Adams, he's just going to absolutely eat upon him. I mean, Aaron Rodgers loves getting him the football. He's one of the best wide receivers in football. They have a great connection. Even if they do double him, that's not something Davante Adams has never seen before, and he should have a pretty solid game versus Philly. They're kind of mid-pack versus wide receivers and 20th DVOA versus the pack. But matchups, for the most part, don't matter for Davante Adams. Just a matter of being able to afford him because he is super expensive this week. Now, dropping down to some more affordable wide receivers, we have Allen Robinson at $6,700, who I think is one of my favorite wide receivers on the entire slate. I feel like he's just a bit too cheap for how talented he is and the amount of volume he gets every single week. Had a really good game versus the Packers last week. Now, they were trailing for the most of that game, but I would not be shocked if somehow Chicago finds a way to be trailing versus Detroit, but I don't think it's going to be a blowout by any means. It's only a 3-point spread here, so it should be a close game, and I think Allen Robinson should have a really solid outing versus Detroit. The volume's there every single week, around 10 targets per game. Not quite as many yards or touchdowns as Davante Adams, but unfortunately, Allen Robinson doesn't have the luxury of being able to play with Aaron Rodgers. He has had some bad quarterback play throughout his entire career, and I said this in the last video, but I would love Allen Robinson. I would love to be able to see Allen Robinson play with a really good quarterback like Aaron Rodgers, maybe just for a game. I'd love to see what happens. Because the poor guy had to play with Blake Bortles, Nick Foles, Mitch Trubisky. There's probably someone else I'm missing off the top of my head, but it's been a tough time for Allen Robinson there. But great spot versus Detroit, and he should be able to dominate here. Had a great outing versus the Packers last week, had 2 touchdowns. But the Detroit Lions, they're 20th DVOA versus the pass, allowing over 40 DraftKings points per game to the position. They're 24th versus wide receivers and allowing close to 200 receiving yards per game. So Robinson, he's in an excellent spot here, and he might be my favorite spend-up wide receiver on the entire slate. Devontae Parker, the price has come up a little bit. I believe he was $5,900 or $5,800 last week. Now he's up to $6,400. Now, if Tua happens to be the starter, they said they're not going to name a starter until Sunday, so that really sucks for fantasy purposes. But if Tua is the starter, I'm going to be out on Devontae Parker. just because I trust Ryan Fitzpatrick to chuck the ball to Devontae Parker like 10 plus times this game. I think he had close to 15 targets last week. It's a great matchup versus the Jets, and a pretty good matchup here versus Cincinnati. Now the price, it makes them a tougher fit, and to be honest, I'd rather try to find the $300 more for Allen Robinson, but they still have a team total of 26.75 this week. Only problem is they're 11.5 point favorites at home, meaning they might just be running the ball in the second half of the fourth quarter if the game happens to get out of hand, but the volume will be there for Parker if Fitzpatrick happens to be the starter, and the Bengals are 26th versus the pass, and they're 20th versus wide receivers, and they're allowing over one receiving touchdown per game to position, which is the most of all the players that we have listed. So it's a good spot for Parker. Just going to depend on what quarterback is going to be starting. And then we have the duo of Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. Both are too cheap in my opinion, and since I like both those guys, I did add Jared Goff to the quarterback list that we talked about early on. If I had to pick one, I say pretty much every single week that they're the same exact play, so I always go with the cheaper guy, and the cheaper guy tends to be Robert Woods, so I'm going to lean Robert Woods over Cooper Kupp. It looks like ownership has that the same way, as Robert Woods is projected to be one of the highest owned wide receivers on the slate, which I totally get. It's a good spot versus Arizona, and if you're looking at the numbers overall, they ranked 22nd versus wide receivers despite being 12th DVA versus the pass. So both guys are in pretty good spots here. If I had to pick one, I'm going with Woods. They're both averaging close to 6 catches per game. Cooper Kupp's the slightly more targeted wide receiver with a 25% target share compared to Woods' 22.5%, but both have similar ADOTs. They're both kind of possession guys for the most part, and both are really safe for fantasy purposes every single week on Draftkings because the PPR site, and both guys are really good for PPR scoring because they just kind of get those possession check down catches for the most part. So I definitely like both, but if I had to pick one, I'm going to go with Robert Woods there. Brandon Cooks at $5,600, more than likely going to be one of the highest owned players on the entire slate. And I feel like it's a good week to go mid-range at wide receivers, just because I would like to spin up a little bit the running back position with a guy like Dalvin Cook or Derrick Henry. And there's just a lot of good mid-range wide receivers here, like Cooks, Woods, Kupp, Parker, Robinson, all guys kind of in the mid-range. Robinson's kind of pushing it there, but they're just all a little bit too cheap in my opinion. No, I think Parker's kind of right where he should be, but you guys know what I mean. But anyway, Brandon Cooks, there's not going to be any Will Fuller here. And Will Fuller had around a 20-25% target share, and he was the best wide receiver in that offense. Now you take him out of the equation, those targets got to go somewhere around 7 targets per game. So Cooks, he's going to be the new wide receiver one in this offense. I mean, the other guy is super talented, and I know he's been passed around the league quite a bit, but the guy's pretty good, and you've always wanted Deshaun Watson's wide receiver one. Now, I know he had DeAndre Hopkins, and Will Fuller's pretty good, but Brandon Cooks, I mean, the volume was already there for him, so I would not be surprised if he saw 10-plus targets in this game, and he's only $5,600. He's priced like Will Fuller is still playing, which I realized they got the news after Draftkings released their prices, but he's seeing close to 7 targets per game this season, a 22% target share. We'll probably see that around 25 to 30% in this game. Now, the matchup versus the Colts, I mean, overall, they've been pretty tough versus wide receivers. 6 fewest points per game. They're 60 versus the pass. But in his wide receiver versus quarterback matchup advantage column this week, actually a pretty big advantage there versus Rock Ya-Sin. It's always a fun name I like saying every time he pops up for me. So, Brandon Cooks, I think he's in a good spot here. And it's a 51-point over-under in this game. I realize the matchup versus the Colts overall, they've been tough fantasy points-wise, giving up points per game to the wide receiver position, but being the new wide receiver one for Deshaun Watson kind of trumps everything. So $5,600, definitely kind of a cash game staple for me this week at his price point. Corey Davis, $5,100. Not seeing him get a ton of love this week, especially in ownership projections, but definitely makes me like him a little bit more. At $5,100, I feel like he's too cheap here. AJ Brown, obviously, if I could get the AJ Brown over Corey Davis, I would, but that's about a $2,000 or $3,000 price difference there. And Corey Davis gets volume every single week. He's averaging over 6 targets per game, has around a 23% target share, a 33% market share of the team's air yards, 70 receiving yards per game. For the most part, you can kind of count on him. And we have a team 12 nearly 30 this week and a 53.5 point over-under with a 5.5 point spread. This could definitely be a shootout here in Tennessee, and the Browns are going to be without Denzel Ward. So this secondary is just, I don't really think they're going to have many answers here for Corey Davis and A.J. Brown. And if they absolutely sell out to stop Derrick Henry, which I think that's what they're going to want to do, we could see some pretty soft coverage for A.J. Brown and Corey Davis. So I like both of these guys, but you can get Corey Davis at a pretty massive discount here. And like I mentioned earlier, the Browns just aren't that good versus the pass. They're 23rd DVOA, and they're 21st versus wide receivers. And you got to keep in mind, there's no Denzel Ward, which definitely makes this defense a lot softer. So definitely Corey Davis at only $5,100. Then after that, we have a trio of really cheap wide receivers that I think are fine lineup fillers, but definitely not core pieces to my lineup. Denzel Mims, $4,100. I know there's some concern with Sam Darnold being back last week. We're not sure if he's really going to get the ball to Mims too much, but he still had 8 targets in that game, had around 10 fantasy points, which was fine for his price point. Price did come up a little bit this week, but it's a great matchup versus Las Vegas. And on the season, he's got a 40.9% market share of the team's air yards. I know you have to factor in that there's been different quarterbacks under center, but still, it's pretty good. 8 out of 16.1. And the matchup here versus the Raiders are 16th DVA versus the pass, and they're 19th versus wide receivers. So it's a fine spot for Denzel Mims at $4,100. And they're always pretty much big dogs. I know their team total is only 19.25, but they should be throwing the ball quite a bit. And it's definitely a good spot through the air versus the Raiders. Kiki Cutie at $3,500. With Will Fuller being out, you just got to redistribute some targets, so Kiki Cutie should get some more looks in this game. And he does have a good track record versus the Colts. I think it was the playoff game a few years ago. I just remember playing that slate. I forget if it was a showdown or a 2-game slate, but Cutie absolutely went off in that game. I know it has no correlation whatsoever. It was in my mind, so I wanted to bring it up. But Cutie at $3,500. If you look at his numbers this season, he only has a 9% target share. But again, we're taking Will Fuller off the field, so he's going to see more routes, more snaps, and he should be decently involved in this offense, and he's only $3,500. And what Vegas thinks is going to be a decently high-scoring game with a 51-point over-under, which is one of the highest totals of the week. And then Darnell Mooney at $3,400. I believe he had 9 targets last week, and on the season he's averaging close to 6 targets per game and a 15% target share, and an 80 out of 14.3. So there's definitely upside here versus Detroit. Kind of already talked about it with Allen Robinson, but it's an overall very soft matchup versus their secondary. And for as much as he's involved in the offense pretty much every single week, $3,400 just seems a bit too cheap in my opinion, so I think he's a fine value wide receiver this week if you want to pair him up with Mitch Trubisky. And then moving on to the tight end position, as you can see, we only have 3 guys listed here. There's just not many tight ends I like this week, so I think we're either going expensive with Waller, mid-range with Tanyan, or super cheap with Jordan Akins. So we'll show up top with Darren Waller, $6,100. He is the tight end 1 this week, and he's also the most expensive tight end on this slate. And when I say this week, I mean on this slate. Obviously, Travis Kelce, and he's going to be the tight end 1 every single week. But he's still one of the most targeted tight ends in the league, around 8 targets per game, about 6 catches per game, 26% target share, 55% weight opportunity share, 8 out of only 6.2. But it's a good matchup versus the Jets, and they're ranked 27th versus tight ends this year, and they're also 32nd DVA versus the pass. So if you got the money for Waller, I do think he's a pretty good play this week. I know he didn't do much of all last game, but keep in mind Derek Carr was absolutely atrocious, so was the entire Las Vegas Raiders offense. So I'm expecting them to bounce back a bit here versus the Jets, and they do have a team total close to 28 this week, so I think Waller's in a good spot to bounce back. Robert Tonyan, $3,700. I feel like he's a bit too cheap here. He's had pretty nice back-to-back games, and he's gotten to the end zone both times. It's another good matchup versus Philadelphia, and he has a pretty cheap pairing with Aaron Rodgers, averaging over half a receiving touchdown per game this season. Pretty low, 11.5% target share. But again, we can't ask too much for our tight ends here. And the Eagles are 22nd versus tight ends, 20th DVA versus the pass. I think he's just a fine mid-range tight end who I feel like is a bit too cheap. Then Jordan Akins at $2,900. Man, I'm still mad about Jordan Akins on Thanksgiving. He was in my core plays that week, and he had 2 touchdown opportunities, and he dropped both of them, just straight up dropped them. I know Deshaun Watson could have been at least maybe a little bit more accurate and made it a little bit more easier for him, but still, you're in the NFL, you should be able to catch those footballs, and he just dropped 2 touchdowns, which sucked because I think he was 27% owned, which I know is pretty high, but on a Thanksgiving Day slate, on a 2-game slate, that wasn't that high owned. And if he would have caught them, he would have easily been the best tight end play of the slate. So still salty about that. But assuming he doesn't have Butterfingers in this one, and only $2,100 with Will Fuller being out of the equation, he should be a pretty solid play. The matchup versus Indy, they're pretty tough versus quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers and tight ends. They're allowing the third fewest points per game to the position, but he's only $2,900. He's actually got a 33% advantage, tight end versus linebacker advantage this week per PFF, which is actually one of the highest of the entire week. 58% of his routes are in the slot, so I think he's fine. He should get a handful of targets, and hopefully he can hold on to the ball this time around. And then as for the defenses, the most boring position to talk about, I mainly just try to pick favorites here, or maybe slight favorites, or just defenses that I feel like are a bit too cheap that have turnover opportunity. So the Dolphins defense, they're facing the Cincinnati Bengals offense led by Brandon Allen, so no concerns there. They're 11.5-point favorites at home with only a 15.25 implied team total against them. If you got the money for them, yes, they're a good option. Packers defense versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Carson Wentz has certainly not been someone you can trust to not turn over the ball this year, so I think there's some opportunity there, even though the Packers defense hasn't exactly been that great, but a low team total against them, and they're 8.5-point favorites at home. Vikings are 10-point favorites at home versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Seahawks are 10-point favorites at home versus the Giants, who should have Colt McCoy as their quarterback. And look, I'm a Browns fan. I got the thing on. Got the thing on right now. But Colt McCoy is certainly not the greatest quarterback in the world, so I think they're fine. Even though the Seahawks have been one of the worst pass defenses in football this season. I mean, they were allowing close to 400 passing yards per game at one point this year. That's gone down a little bit, but still overall not that great of a defense. The Bears, I feel like they may be the chalk defense this week. It's just if you're using the passing game, you're probably going to want the Detroit Lions to be able to score some points. So it might not be the greatest correlation play to play the Bears defense with like Trubisky, Robinson, or Darnell Mooney. But they're definitely a good pairing with David Montgomery this week. The Patriots defense, they just kind of grade out well point per otherwise in the projections just because they're $2,400. I don't really want to pick on Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, and Austin Eckler, but they're fine for the price point. And then the Jets defense at $2,100, I know they're not that good of a defense, but fantasy points wise, relative to their price point, they actually haven't been absolutely awful. And Derek Carr was horrendous last week. Now I'm expecting them to bounce back, and they do have a team total of like 28 points against them, or 27.25. So I'm not expecting much from the Jets, but if they can get you like 1 to 5 points, I think you'd take that as a solid W because they're only $2,100. But with that being said, guys, that's going to be it for this video. I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. We'll do the lineup building video tomorrow morning/afternoon. Then we'll do the core plays video later on that evening. And I think that's pretty much it for the rest of the week. So if you want access to the sheet, link is down below to that. You get the cheat sheet there, the notes, the projections. You can hop into the Discord chat as well. It's like $10 a month, so not really trying to break the bank here for you. But there's a lot of information on there that I do think is pretty useful that you should find helpful throughout the entire week. So I think that's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next one, and hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend.